This is a story that we're tracking for you this morning on the AM Report. Women and black and coloured academics are still underrepresented at South Africa's institutions for higher learning. A task team appointed by the Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Nzimande, on the progression of black South African academics found a massive gap at senior levels at most universities. And one of the reasons cited in the findings of this report is the low number of black women academics in the postdoctoral pipeline. Universities now have 2 months to present concrete proposals for transformation. To unpack this story now, we're joined by Ahmed Bawa, who is the CEO of Universities South Africa and in fact served on that ministerial task team. We're also joined by Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng, vice-chancellor of the University of Cape Town. Thank you to both of our guests for joining us on the AM Report this morning. Professor Phakeng, let's begin with you. Tell us your story that really speaks to this issue of underrepresentation, particularly of black women academics in South Africa.
You know, my story is the story of many black women in this country. If you get to the levels that I am at with a B1 rating as a scientist and being vice-chancellor of a university, it doesn't matter what university, you are a survivor, you are a miracle. In fact, it wasn't the plan that you become that successful. And that's how I feel more and more like a miracle, because even at this level, the journey is hard. You work harder than anyone else, more than men do. You raise family. And then when you get there and you are at a higher level, you get criticism, sort of either you got it the wrong way, you slept your way through, or your personality becomes a source of attention. So you never win, because the idea is your type is not allowed. So my view with this report, reading this report, and I've seen other reports, is that the numbers are important, but we've got to deal with the violence that comes with being a black woman in higher education in South Africa. Even if you get hired, and people smile because they know that's what needs to be done, the truth of the matter is you've got from day one knives against you, and they're going to make every argument. In fact, I always say where there's a will to prosecute, there is always evidence. Evidence can be created, manufactured, made, structured, and set up so that you can show up as a villain, especially if they can't find anything wrong with your work. So if they can't fault you on your work, they go to the personality. And that's the struggle of black women. No man is ever called a diva. That's, by the way, when you've achieved and you are moving around, influencing young people positively, you're a diva. Even black men don't get called that. They can be on social media as much as they like. It is okay. But a black woman who is a highly rated scientist is called that. It's as if it's okay. So in a way, you're not so much with the picket line, but you're not in the boardroom. It becomes worse and worse. Had I known this, I would have become mediocre, because I would have been safer. It is not safe to stand out and show up and chase everything that you need to achieve, because once you achieve it, you become more of a target. Your work is no longer the focus. The focus is your personality. And personality can be critiqued in so many ways. Check anywhere, not just in academia, how many women, capable women, fall at the altar of personality. It's not only a South African phenomenon, it gets worse when you're a black woman. And don't think you're going to find white faces fighting against you. The machinery is very sophisticated. Call that racism, and exclusion works in many ways, because they have to co-opt people who look like you and so on, so that the fight looks legitimate. And then you see it looks as you know, to make some things look like that's what they are. So I think we have a tough job ahead, because in a way we've dealt with the first wave of transformation has been accepted. It's about equity. We haven't achieved. We've got to achieve and bring the critical mass, right? But my view, the second wave of transformation is the distribution of privilege. And when I say the distribution of privilege, I'm not talking about distributing money or favors. I'm talking about the power of privilege. Who listens to you, whose story gets believed, who gets written about, how, when, by who, and who fights for that person. I mean, I don't want to get into some specific issues, but it's very interesting when a black woman is on the altar being sacrificed, who comes up to fight for them, or actually nobody. Get a white woman on the altar of sacrifice and look at how the support is unleashed. Very interesting. For me, it's about structural racism in our institutions, but in our country as well, because the redistribution of privilege hasn't happened. It's the second wave, but nobody is willing to give up privilege. And I'm not talking about money. Privilege comes in many, many different ways.
And for some, leveling the playing fields, you know, I'm thinking of the Black Lives Matter movement. For some, that feels like oppression for them, those who cry foul and say all lives matter. But Professor, as you were talking, you know, what you're saying reverberates certainly for you in academia, but it reverberates through all sectors, corporate South Africa as well. If we look at the boardrooms and we look at what executives look like, it's a shade of pale. All of corporate South Africa is to blame for that. I mean, reverse racism, for example, is one of the arguments that's used when we talk about leveling the playing fields. You talked about privilege, you know, whose mistakes are forgiven if those mistakes happen versus who can't overcome those kinds of hurdles. There's so many issues that you've just touched on, and one of the biggest reasons given, for example, by corporate South Africa for their boardrooms being so white is that, you know, we can't find any black executives that are qualified. And I'm sure that in some ways relates to academia as well. What do you say to that kind of argument?
The issue is we can find them. But even if you find them, what do you do with them? They are there. And there are women who, in academia at least, who came up to the DVC level and they went, I don't want this. They go back and be academics. There are examples of those. The media doesn't follow them. I'm not even sure whether they'll be brave enough to say what happened, why they don't want to go forward. Because the violence of the boardroom, the violence of the council chambers, the violence of the Senate hall is unprecedented. You know, so people will be happy to say the manager, the leader should not be violent, bullying, whatever. But in the boardrooms of the very place, you find that it's really, really violent. So the women are there. Some are there who could be growing. I mean, in academia, it's interesting because some people choose to just be high-level academics, to be, I could have done that. I'm a B1 rated scientist. Rare. So I could have said, I just want to be a researcher. I just want to be a professor. And I could have done that, amassed all sorts of professorships and honorary doctorates around the world, become an A-rated scientist, and stay there and have everyone in my discipline regard me and so on and so forth. That's one choice. When I made the decision to come into academia, it wasn't necessarily that was initially something that when I get into academia, I said, I want to be head of department, dean, DVC, vice-chancellor. It was to be a scholar. And some women choose to be that. It is much more peaceful. It is much more exciting. The attacks are less than, they are there, but they are not as vicious as when you go into the management track and you go up. So it's not that they are there. Some are just don't want to put themselves into that situation. They can see what happens with other women, and some would rather go for the difficulty of being a full professor and work in that track, and not cross the track into management.
So, Professor Ahmed Bawa, thank you for standing by and being a part of this discussion as well. Professor Bawa is the CEO of University of South Africa. And Prof, you in fact were a part of this ministerial task team looking into the recruitment, retention and progression of black South African academics. And you know, Professor Phakeng, describes this violence in academia. And in the research that the Ministerial Task Team did you come across the same kinds of accounts by black South African academics, by black women academics as well?
Yeah, there were two kinds of. First of all, good morning, and good morning, Katie. There were two kinds of data kind of collected. The first kind was just data, looking at the numbers and so on, and those were very revealing, of course. And by the way, we know the numbers, so it's, but to get them together and get them in one place was very helpful. The other was really to listen to accounts, to listen to people speaking, and as Professor Phakeng kind of indicates, clear indications of harassment, violence, and so on, and clearly, with a particular emphasis on black women. So it seems to me, at least, that as Professor Phakeng indicates, this is not just a question of saying, let's address the PhD pipeline. That's clearly important, and we must do that. This is really about culture. It's really about the politics of employment, the politics of promotions, the politics of institutional culture that really prevents people from progressing. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is to get our male academics and our senior academics to really listen carefully to what women are saying, and that's something that hasn't happened yet. What we get is this exactly what Professor Phakeng indicates, that when somebody raises something, it's seen to be out of order, seen to be not to be done in the academic sector and so on.
Or seem to be
so
there's
a kind of violence.
Yeah. Professor Bawa, I want to just interject there. Sorry about that. I want to talk to you about, so this important ministerial task team finally being set up. It's a gap that we've seen in academia for decades. Why now? And what are some of the very real steps that will be taken? I mean, we don't want to see this ministerial task team's findings and then we wait another decade before some real changes happen. What are some of the real, right now, changes that are going to happen?
Yeah. No, I think this ministerial task team report is not going to sit on the shelf. I mean, I think that it's going to go to the universities. The universities are going to have to respond within 2 months with plans about how they're going to address these issues. But I'm afraid that actually it's much deeper. I think that there's a need for culture change, and that's something that it's not going to be done just by the institutions, because the institutions are so dominated by a particular culture. So I think it's going to require a really severe kind of introspection, but more importantly, really serious oversight from external structures that will help the universities to work through these big challenges.
Absolutely. Professor Phakeng, I want to get your final comments as we close off our interview. As Professor Bawa says, it's much deeper than just the findings of this ministerial task team. There's a culture, a really entrenched culture, as we know, that needs to change. There is a protection of privilege that takes place in academia and in boardrooms around the country. Your parting shot as we end this interview.
My parting shot is that whilst we're working on the culture, in the meantime, if you appoint a black African woman, make sure that there's already an attack on them before you see it. And the attack is cloaked in many colors. So protect them, speak for them, believe them. Don't start from the position of not believing them, because you get quickly co-opted. And if we do that, we are going to lose, particularly the more capable. The more capable the person, the more of a threat they are, because they know they will change things. And so they will deal with you. So if you appoint them, you have to stand behind them. Protect them at all costs. And know that you haven't appointed a pope. You appointed a person, and you're going to have to stand on them. If they make a mistake, the other people must know that, like them, she's human. But the big thing is protect them. Just appointing them to high office or making them a professor just is not going to solve everything.
Yeah, absolutely. She's human and she is qualified to be there. Thank you to both of our guests for weighing in on this incredibly important issue. Professor Mamokgethi Phakeng is UCT's vice-chancellor. Professor Ahmed Bawa, CEO of Universities of South Africa. He was a part of that ministerial task team to look into the recruitment, retention and progression of black South African academics, particularly black women academics. And universities now have 2 months to present concrete proposals for transformation before that report is submitted to Cabinet.